RWBY is an animated web series created by Monty Ohm and produced by Rooster Teeth, which has been running since about 2013, with the first trailers of the show going up online in late 2012. RWBY is a show that's gone on for far longer than I'm sure most folks have expected it to, and it's also a show that manages to always garner some of the most positive and also negative attention simultaneously. A lot of folks will tell you to do something like just watch the first 3 seasons of the show and then stop from there, or skip this season or that season, or just do this, or maybe now some would even tell you to skip it altogether. And in recent times, folks have even brought up the topic of the RWBY anime adaptation, RWBY Ice Queendom, into the picture. It's all a bit of a mess, and I'm honestly not here to tell you one way or the other how to watch this show, or anything like that. This is a show that I've personally been invested in since I was about 14, and now as a 23-year-old, I'm still along for the ride. I vividly remember the day that the first trailer for RWBY was ever released. It was the red trailer, and I just remember showing my friends in middle school the trailer because I thought it was the coolest shit ever, and in my defense, it was pretty cool. But I'm getting a tad bit ahead of myself. Clearly, I hold a lot of investment in this show, given that I've kept up with it for about a decade or so. But today we're going to be discussing the first volume, because that's what RWBY calls its seasons, as well as the trailers that came before the first volume. This show is one that I understand is a bit of a mixed bag in a lot of regards, but I still hold it near and dear to my heart. As well, while I do love this show, I am of course still going to be critical of certain things here and there, but don't take that as some sort of hatred or even a personal attack on you or anyone working on the show. We all got opinions, and considering you're on a video discussing my own, I hope you're ready to hear them. Enough intro talk, let's get started on our retrospective journey through the world of Remnant and RWBY as a whole, starting with Volume 1. Before we continue on, if you end up enjoying the content and want to get early access to these videos, as well as previews and your name in the video credits, consider supporting me on Patreon for $5 a month. If you're unable to do so or simply don't want to, however, no worries. A like and a sub is more than enough to support the channel. Back to RWBY though. So, first things first, what is RWBY? To the uninitiated. RWBY, like I said earlier, is an animated web series that follows the main team of Team RWBY and their journey towards trying to become huntresses, people who basically eliminate threats or creatures of evil in their world and help protect that world around them, and maybe even be the best at being said huntress. Along the way, there's another crew we get a major focus on, and every single person that fights in this world's weapon, gun-shaped or not, will shoot a bullet or some type of beam like a gun at some point or another. It's a fairly simple but fun concept that brought in a lot of people, myself included of course. And with our explanation out of the way, and before we get on to the show itself, let's talk about the 4 trailers that led up to the show's first volume. The red, white, black, and yellow trailers. I feel these often get overlooked when discussing RWBY, so I want to try and take a quick jab at talking about them and giving each trailer the appreciation it deserves. First up is the red trailer, released November 7th, 2012. We got our first ever look at just what on earth RWBY was. It had all the trademarks of what RWBY would become and drew in a lot of people. The trailer follows Ruby Rose, our protagonist at what was later to be revealed her mother's grave. As RWBY leaves the grave and enters a nearby forest, she's approached and then attacked by some weird wolf-like creatures, which are presumably early versions of the evil creatures in this world we'll come to know as Grimm. There isn't much story to this one, but bringing it back to their composer, Jeff Williams, what we do get, however, is an incredible song that matches the intensity and energy of the fight going on perfectly. If there's one thing I can nitpick though, it's as great as the music is, the mixing on the sound effects is a little too loud, so whenever RWBY shoots or slashes, it's like the loudest and crunchiest noise in the world. But I wouldn't say it outright ruins the trailer, just definitely caught me off guard when I was revisiting this trailer and noticing that nowadays. Anyway, after slashing and shooting the shit out of the wolf creatures, RWBY strikes a cute pose, and that's the end of the trailer. I understand that maybe nowadays this trailer maybe hasn't aged too well for folks who never got into it back in the day, but as someone who has watched RWBY since the very start, I'd say it holds up pretty well for the most part. The action and fight choreography is still phenomenal, and the music is still just as great as the first time I ever heard it. Next trailer is the White trailer. We're quickly introduced to the next member of the team, Weiss Schnee, as she walks up on stage to sing for a crowd. The singing here, and for basically most of the RWBY tracks, is done by Casey Lee Williams. One of the craziest details about this being that Casey would have been about 14 or 15 or so working on these tracks, and honestly then and still to this day she does an incredible job on the vocals for any track she's on. Back to the trailer, as the singing slows down for a moment, we move into the reflection of the stage and see Weiss battling against a giant suit of armor. While she manages to get in a couple of good slashes, she eventually gets punched back by the suit of armor, which leads into one of my favorite moments of these trailers. Followed by Weiss stumbling back up and the music ramping up to match. One little detail I never noticed back when I watched these trailers as a kid that I notice now is that the trailer also shows us how Weiss got her scar on her face. As the armor goes in for another slash, Weiss fucking parries that shit and finally regains control of the battle via freezing the suit of armor, as well as moving around it with her ability before holding it in the air and finishing it. The music finishes and Weiss bows as the audience cheers. This trailer is one that I feel I never gave enough credit or attention back when it released, although part of that was also just because I didn't really like Weiss much back then. Nowadays, however, I can definitely appreciate every aspect of this trailer, and I honestly don't have any real complaints or criticisms about this one. I think this trailer is just incredibly good overall. The music does a great job at giving us an idea who the hell Weiss is, even before we even officially see her in the show. The action's phenomenal, and the visuals have held up pretty decently as well. Hooray for our Ice Queen. Next trailer is the Black trailer. This trailer is interesting in that it probably has the most story/lore relevance compared to the others. In specific, aside from introducing us to Blake Belladonna, one of our main characters, it also introduces us to someone who will become a main antagonist a little later, that being Adam Torres, the red-haired dude. Anyway, Adam goes up to Blake to tell her that it's time, and they go and ambush an oncoming train. Right off the bat, I'm gonna be honest. This trailer has the most interesting visuals of the 4 trailers, but it also has the worst voice acting of the 4 trailers. Neither of Blake or Adam's lines are very well mixed, and Adam in specific has a fucking potato mic, and it's very sloppy overall. To make up for the shit mic at least, Adam manages to have a pretty cool weapon. It's a red blade that can be shot out of its sheath like a goddamn bullet in a gun. It's sick as heck. Hey, wait a second. Where have I seen that shit? Sorry about that. I just thought it was funny. Anyway, as Blake and Adam fight off the robots trying to keep the train safe, they eventually come across whatever the hell they're looking for. When they do, Blake questions the safety of the crew on the train, to which Adam dismisses her concerns before they get ambushed by a huge-ass robot and blown the fuck back, quite frankly. Adam then asks Blake to buy him some time, so she helps fight off the bot for a bit until it fires a laser at Adam. Although this time, he seemingly absorbs the attack with his blade, and as the bot approaches him, he swiftly slashes back in a surprisingly cool shot, especially for early RWBY. But after this sick display of bloodshed, Blake ultimately decides to part ways with Adam here and cuts and separates the train cars. And that's the trailer. Definitely a bit more rough around the edges, but there's still a lot of good parts to this trailer, I'd say. The biggest complaint about this trailer is quite frankly the voice acting, but I'd say the rest is pretty solid. I've always enjoyed this red forest this trailer takes place in. It's a really pretty environment and adds a good bit of color to the trailer as a whole. As well, the song in this trailer, From Shadows, has always been one of my favorite RWBY tracks there, so there's that as well. Last up is the yellow trailer. This trailer introduces us to the last of our main crew and my personal favorite character in the show, Yang Xiaolong. Yang arrives at some club on her motorcycle, and as she walks through the club, we get a quick glimpse at a handful of characters that we'll be seeing once again later down the line. Anyway, Yang walks up to the bar and asks for a drink. After doing so, the guy in charge of the club, a man named Junior, questions if Yang is even old enough to be in this club. Yang recognizes the man, and when Junior asks who she is in return, Yang grabs him by the nuts and asks him for info on finding a woman. That's sexual assault, Yang. When Junior reveals he has no info for her, and just as his lackeys are moving towards Yang, she decides to toy with Junior some more and offers him a kiss. Let's not think too hard about the details on this one. It's just a setup for Yang to punch the shit out of him. As all the security rush at Yang, she blows everyone the fuck away because of course she does. She's Yang. And as the club lights and the music keep going, the DJ pulls out a fucking gun, so Yang just kicks the shit out of him. Before we continue on, I just want to highlight Yang reloading her gauntlets here. It's fairly simple, but in my opinion, super cool. Anyway, the twins we saw earlier in the bar show up and threaten Yang, and as they're fighting, Yang finds an opening and punches one of the twins away and fights the other one-on-one. And after a clean game of footsie, she fucking roundhouse kicks the shit out of her to the point where the music changes. Junior walks back in, but this time with his weapon, a giant bat rocket launcher hybrid, which he immediately uses and shoots at her with. After smacking Yang with his oversized bat, it's basically over for him, because unfortunately, Yang's whole ability and shtick is absorbing hits taken to make her own attacks stronger, and Yang goes in for the final couple swings, with one of the swings sending Junior flying back. Yang notices he tore off some of her hair and goes crazy with one final swing at the guy, which not only blows him out of his own club, but also shatters every window in it. Anyway, RWBY's just outside the club for some reason. RWBY and Yang are apparently sisters as well, and that's the trailer. Very loose story relevance compared to something like the Black trailer, but the music, the setting, the fights, especially just make it all my absolute favorite trailer of the four. I'm totally not biased because it's my favorite character or anything like that. Come on now. While some aspect of these trailers have definitely not aged the best in current times, I do still think they hold up pretty well for the most part. Obviously, I'll always hold a bias towards them since I've been there since the first trailer, but even now I do think there is some value in going through these trailers, especially if you're a new fan or even an old fan who simply never got around to watching them. And with that, we can finally get on with looking back at RWBY Volume 1, so let's get started with the series itself. Episode 1 of RWBY begins with a storybook-like explanation of the world, its people, its evils, and so on. Apparently, humans gained the power of something called dust, and were able to advance as a result. With the lore dump over, we see some weird cartoony Tumblr sexy man wannabe running around with some henchmen before walking into a nearby dust shop and robbing it. As they're robbing it, one of the henchmen notices and tries to get RWBY's attention, but she's just listening to some music so she couldn't hear the commotion going on. RWBY, in response to potentially getting robbed, sends the henchman fucking flying. As you do in these situations, I suppose? She then busts out her signature weapon, the Crescent Rose. It's a giant scythe that is also a sniper rifle. It's pretty cool. Evil villain man, his name is Torchwick by the way, sends his men after RWBY, but she manages to easily defeat every one of them. Torchwick then uses this opportunity to use his weird cane that is also a gun to make a getaway, but RWBY follows after him to the rooftop. As his getaway is arriving and just as he's about to explode some dust to deal with RWBY, the blast is shielded by a woman who then also fires back at Torchwick's getaway until they manage to slip away from RWBY and this unnamed woman. Well, it also turns out this woman is a huntress. In the world of RWBY, huntsmen are basically the heroes of the world who defeat bad guys, and also the weird creatures with the skulls named Grimm that you'll come to see a lot more of later. Upon noticing the woman is a huntress, RWBY fangirls heavily until the woman scolds her for what she did. This woman is Glinda Goodwitch, by the way. She informs RWBY that someone would like to meet her, and in walks the headmaster of the school RWBY has always wanted to attend, Professor Ozpin. He recognizes RWBY has silver eyes, a plot point that won't really become important until a good bit later, but also questions where she got her abilities to fight. And RWBY tells him that she learned it from her Uncle Crow. Like Crow, but spelled with a Q. RWBY tells the two that she wants to become a huntress and that Yang is apparently already about to attend Beacon. Luckily for RWBY, he grants her permission to attend as well, despite being a little too young. On the trip to the school itself, Yang smothers RWBY with some love and congratulations for getting into the same school, but RWBY's a little more worried about fitting in. On the news, they bring up Torchwick's robbery and that an organization known as the White Fang is apparently causing more issues. Glinda introduces all the students to Beacon Academy, and some blonde guy gets motion sickness and throws up on the ship and gets some on Yang's shoe. That's it. That's episode 1. It's a very simple and cheesy first episode. It's got this awkward charm to it, but between the fight with Torchwick's henchmen and the music in the first episode, it's clear there's a lot of potential for this show. There's no doubt it's a little rough around the edges, but I don't think it's outright bad or cringy to the point where it's not worth watching one bit. Episode 2 begins with the students arriving at Beacon Academy, and Blonde Dude throws up some more. RWBY stares in awe at the students and all their weapons, but Yang wonders why she doesn't just try and make some new friends before she just kinda ditches RWBY. That's rough. To make matters worse, RWBY stumbles into a girl's luggage and is told off by said girl before sneezing and causing an explosion on her from the dust in the area. Don't question me on how that works, but apparently that's how it is. That's Weiss Schnee, by the way. Blake Belladonna, the last of our other protagonists, walks up and grabs a vial of dust that fell at her feet and overhears Weiss telling off RWBY some more. She walks up and reveals to RWBY that Weiss is some big snooty rich girl whose father owns a dust company that is super shady and controversial, which causes Weiss to storm off angrily, and RWBY tries to apologize. Blake walks away because she is Blake, and Blonde Dude from earlier comes up to RWBY and reveals his name to be John. RWBY shows her weapon and John shows his, sword and shield. Like, that's it. It's a sword and a shield. RWBY tells John she made her own weapon, to which John tells her his gear was just passed down from his family. And the two continue conversing about basically nothing. In case my summary didn't give it away, this episode is very short. A lot of episodes in this first season, and honestly the original 3 volumes of RWBY can vary greatly in length. This episode in particular is barely 6 minutes long, with a minute of that being the opening and the ending. This isn't to slam the show or anything either. I'm well aware they had next to no budget when initially starting RWBY, and Monty Oum always spoke about working relentlessly to get episodes done. It's no surprise that especially in the first volume that there will be episodes where basically nothing but character introductions happen. And in the case of this episode, considering it lets us meet the other 2 main characters of the show, I'd say it did a good enough job at that. We got the idea that Weiss is stuck up and a bit of a bitch, and that Blake is very elusive and mysterious. That much is good. The rest is just whatever, quite frankly. John is a main character and does get his own story and moments in the spotlight, but here there isn't too much to say beyond him throwing up and being a little awkward. Admittedly, maybe the episode length is a good thing, because if this got dragged out beyond 5 minutes, I'm sure it would only suffer more from not having much to it. Episode 3 starts off with RWBY and John arriving with the rest of the students for the opening ceremony. RWBY chats with Yang about the incident with Weiss and, oh hey, it's Weiss and she's here to lecture RWBY some more. Yang tries to defuse the situation and RWBY tries to properly introduce herself to Weiss, and she replies like a total bitch. Ozpin then gives a speech to the students about how they need to approach things at this school, and Glinda gives them further instructions. John tries to hit on the girls. Alright man, and in a fucking school sleepover, because that's a thing here for some reason, Yang thirsts over shitty 3D dudes before John walks by. RWBY's having some serious trouble adjusting to the new school and lack of friends. Yang tries reassuring RWBY that everything will be fine, especially considering it's been about a day, and the two notice Blake reading a book and decide to approach her and maybe make a new friend. Unfortunately, their conversation doesn't go the best. But RWBY then asks Blake about her book, and she tells them that it's about a man with 2 souls, each fighting for control of his body. Okay. But her saying this reminds RWBY about wanting to become a huntress because of the stories she grew up hearing in books. Sensing things are going a little too perfectly now, Weiss shows up and scolds the duo for causing so much noise, and Blake blows out a candle, which apparently signifies the end of the episode. It's another pretty short episode, but it's a little better than the previous one. Early on, I feel as though they put a little too much emphasis on the whole Weiss is a bitch stuff, but if you don't like Weiss, especially if you only have something like this volume as reference, I fully get it. While I understand it may be to further build up the character into something likable, it's definitely a bit much this early on. But I don't really have much else to criticize or complain about in this episode. It's short and sweet and more or less to the point. Far from perfect, but given its short runtime, I can't take too much issue with something that is over and done with so quickly. Episode 4 starts off with a quick introduction to two characters that are going to be a part of the other team that we'll be following alongside Team RWBY. These two are Nora Valkyrie and Lai Ren. Hilariously, our introduction to these two is Nora blabbing and annoying Ren. She's trying to get the two of them to be on the same team together, and then we see Yang and RWBY talking. Yang reminds RWBY that she's going to have to work with and meet new people here if she expects to do anything, but as she pushes more for RWBY to work with others, RWBY gets offended at the idea, and John walks by and adds nothing to the plot of the episode. At least we get to see the last member of the other team, Pyrrha Nikos. Weiss starts sucking up to Pyrrha and borderline asks desperately to join the same team as her. Unfortunately, John is back to break up Weiss's delusions of joining Pyrrha's team, and then proceeds to not only hit on Weiss, but also Pyrrha. Stay classy, John. Weiss tries to tell John off by explaining Pyrrha's notoriety to him, but he has no idea what the hell she's saying. Despite Weiss trying to put John in his place, Pyrrha decides to encourage him. This will be a recurring trend between these two, so get used to it. Anyway, Pyrrha throws a fucking spear at John. And from there we get the start of whatever the hell this school's first test is for the students, as Ozpin and Glinda explain how this is gonna work. The quick rundown being that they're going to be flung into the air and into the forest. Whoever they see first when they land will be their partner for the rest of their 4 years at the academy. John does a fucking comically loud gulp, like I'm not even making this up. But each pair is going to need to collect a chess piece artifact and return in order to be graded. The catch being that there's going to be Grimm throughout the forest. John decides now's the perfect time to ask for what's the plan for landing after being launched, to which Ozpin responds that everyone needs to have their own strategy, and then John is flung into the air. Oops. This episode is slightly longer than the previous two and allows us to meet what is basically the rest of our main cast, so I don't mind it much. The only element I find a little strange is John hitting on Weiss and Pyrrha despite a lot of his early character being this silly little pathetic man, so it's a bit hard to believe given that. I don't have much else to say on this episode besides it being solid, bare minimum. I guess one noteworthy thing is that Lai Ren was originally voiced by Monty Oum, the creator of the show, and he voiced him until his passing in 2015, in which his brother, Neith Oum, took up the role and is still portraying Lai Ren to this day. Rest in peace, Monty Oum. Episode 5 picks right back up with everyone going through with their landing strategies. Ren spins around his tree with his gun sickle things, Yang uses her gauntlets to help move around in the air, Pyrrha kinda just busts through shit and she sees John falling to his doom. So she puts her spear to good use once more and uses it to catch him before he falls. RWBY finally lands and starts thinking about needing to find Yang immediately. So she begins to worry and cope about, well, what if she comes across literally anyone else? And while going through her options, she stumbles across the one she probably didn't want to, Weiss. Weiss tries to walk away, but when the next person she ends up seeing is John, she decides to go back with RWBY instead. RWBY is excited at Weiss returning and it's adorable. Pyrrha asks John if he has any spots on his team, and he begrudgingly accepts, while he's still stuck on a tree being held up by her spear. Back with the besties, Weiss is annoyed and worried about RWBY's performance, and RWBY tries her best to reassure her in every regard, but maybe comes on a little too strongly on still wanting to be friends. Like, she really wants to be friends. Finally, RWBY somehow wanders off 2 steps and Weiss loses her, and Grimm starts attacking her. And, that's the end of the episode. This episode is quite literally the shortest episode in the season, and thus there's barely much to say about it. It's honestly crazy looking back on this season and seeing how many of these episodes are hovering just around 6 minutes or under. I don't think it's really the end of the world or a deal breaker necessarily with the show, but it does make me wonder how the episodes would come together if there was more of a budget or even just more time and folks working on this initial season of the show. Ah well, that's what shit like RWBY Ice Queendom is there for, I suppose, so let's move on. Episode 6 continues the story with Yang exploring and calling out to see if anyone is in the area when she stumbles across some Grimm. She promptly beats the fuck out of the 2 Grimm, but the creatures made one crucial mistake, and that was cutting off a piece of her hair. So she goes full angry mode and more or less kills one. Right as she's about to finish off the other, it's defeated by Blake, and it seems like these two are gonna be partners now. Cool. Back with the bickering duo, Weiss is fighting off the Grimm from last episode, and as she does so, she's intricately thinking through all her moves and is very concentrated on the fight at hand. Or rather, she was until RWBY appears to help out, which ruins her concentration. Unsurprisingly, the two begin to argue some more while trying to take down the crowd of creatures, and oops, the forest is now on fire. Great going, Weiss. The two then flee the fire they started and continue arguing some more. Aren't these two just the best of friends? RWBY gets so pissed off she cuts down a tree. Even scarier is the giant feather that then falls from the sky. Surely this isn't gonna be some sort of foreshadowing, is it? Back with John and Pyrrha, the two are exploring around and hear gunfire, signifying others are nearby. Pyrrha pushes forward, and when she moves a tree branch that smacks John back and injures him, it dawns on Pyrrha. John has no aura. To explain aura as simply as possible, it's the power of their soul. For the most part in the show, it's used to take a good amount of hits. Think of like an HP meter in like an RPG or something more or less. But anyway, Pyrrha uses this opportunity to use her own aura to unlock John's, and it heals him. From this, she also notices that John apparently has a lot of aura. Oh, and by the way, as all of this is going on, Ren's just busy fighting a giant snake Grimm. And after defeating the creature and dusting himself off, Nora appears and boops Ren on the nose. Cute. Another exposition kind of episode, but I don't mind this one as much. It helps us get a better grasp at these other characters we haven't fully explored just as much, as well as the other pair dynamics here. Pretty solid episode, and the fight with Ren and the Grimm was just an added bit of flair that I appreciate greatly. Episode 7 is another short one. This episode begins with Glinda and Ozpin going through the pairs that have formed, and she notes that John's skills thus far have not reflected what have been shown in his transcripts. Aside from that, she asks what Ozpin used for the relics this year, and he kinda just doesn't answer. The old married couple are still arguing, but this time it's over being loss. RWBY mocks Weiss, and it's honestly really fucking funny.
Just keep moving. Oh, just keep moving. Hurry up. Wow, watch where you're going. Why are you so bossy?
Weiss continues telling RWBY off, but then just walks away. Yang and Blake are seemingly not in need of couples therapy and arrive at where the artifacts are at and grab one. Back with Pyrrha and John, they enter a cave in hopes of finding the artifact, but John being John drops the torch, so now they're stuck in darkness. John sees something shiny and assumes it's a relic, but when he tries to grab it, it turns out it's the glowing tail of a Grimm, and he screams out. As he does so, my favorite moment of the first season happens.
Some girl's in trouble.
Pyrrha rushes the hell out of the cave, reasonably so, as John hangs in there and keeps crying out to Pyrrha. Unfortunately for John, it looks like it's time that he gets flung again for the sake of plot convenience, and then RWBY's also falling from the sky? Yeah, I'm not too sure what happened there. This episode is very much kind of just the same as the previous shorter ones in that it's character banter more than anything, but I suppose the one good thing is that some characters finally found artifacts, and they've also finally mentioned what's up with John's actual skill versus what's actually needed to be at the supposedly prestigious academy. That's something that'll get discussed later on, but having an ounce of doubt relating to that from this early on is what makes it interesting in my opinion. Aside from that, really not much of a noteworthy episode beyond the funny moment and I guess also the random bit of RWBY falling from the sky. While a lot of previous episodes have felt like segments of what would be a full episode, we finally reached the halfway point of Volume 1 and the episode that made me realize that this show was truly something special. Episode 8. This episode begins with Weiss and RWBY being the best of friends. Just kidding, they're arguing again. This time it's about RWBY's decision to hold on to some giant bird Grimm, but RWBY decides to let go and also tells Weiss to jump off. So, I guess that's where she fell from? It's weird. Anyway, John crashes into RWBY and oh no, a giant Grimm has appeared. Oh, just kidding, Nora dealt with it. Ren asks Nora not to do that again and she grabs an artifact for them. Hey, I wonder where Pyrrha's at. Oh yeah, giant scorpion Grimm is chasing her, almost forgot about that. RWBY finally reunites with Yang and Nora is also there. But now Yang is fucking pissed because things keep getting crazier by the second. And apparently Weiss is still on the bird. Finally she jumps off and John goes in to help her, but the two comically fall. Only thing missing from it being a ridiculously cheesy and comical fall is either of them holding up a sign that goes, yikes. Pyrrha then gets flung towards the cast and Yang, I shit you not, goes,
Great, the gang's all here.
this show is uncontainable levels of cheesy sometimes. It's like whoever wrote some of the lines just got done watching a Marvel movie, and their only takeaway was that the funny moments were the best part. My poking fun at the writers aside, RWBY decides she can definitely handle fighting the Scorpion Grimm by herself. She cannot. Then the big-ass bird Grimm appears once again. It's almost as if we're building up to a climax of sorts. And as RWBY's fighting the bird, her cape gets stuck on one of the feathers that it threw out. So, Weiss finally decides to be a good friend and helps her from being hurt from the Grimm via her sword that uses dust. RWBY and Weiss finally decide to make amends and maybe be friends for like the first time in the whole set of episodes. Yang gives RWBY a hug and everyone stands there for a bit before realizing, oh yeah, giant bird Grimm is coming back. So RWBY and John grab an artifact for their partners, and the whole group plan to run away and get to where they need to be to finish the assignment. As they're making their way there, the bird and the scorpion both return, and so Nora works on distracting the bird to give the others a chance to move forward. Blake and Ren stop the scorpion for a moment as everyone else moves in some more, and as the bird dives the bridge, it collapses, splitting off Pyrrha, Ren, and Blake. Nora, being Nora, decides to close the gap by breaking the rest of the bridge with her hammer grenade launcher and launching her and John towards the scorpion. Upon doing so, however, she accidentally knocks off Blake, who's luckily able to move towards the others and fight the bird with RWBY, Weiss, and Yang. So, it's RWBY, Weiss, Blake, and Yang against the bird, and John, Nora, Pyrrha, and Ren against the scorpion. This is the fight we've been building up to so far. Everything before it has been less than stellar, but I do feel this fight does honestly make it worth it. Seeing this fight for the first time was genuinely a special moment. This fight feels as though everyone is doing their part in some way or another. Yes, even John giving out orders is pushing the fight forward, and he's doing great. But for the actual fight itself, Team RWBY gets to work on messing up this bird. Yang feeds the bird fucking bullets. Weiss moves forward, trapping it into mice, and Blake and Yang help set up to launch RWBY at the bird. RWBY is launched, grabs the bird by the neck with her scythe, and with the help of Weiss's glyphs, you know those weird circle things she uses here and there, she runs up the side of the cliff and decapitates it after speeding towards the top. It's so goddamn cool. The other groups stare in awe as RWBY stands at the top, and Yang, again I shit you not, goes,
"Well, that was a thing."
I can't make this shit up. It's so cheesy. Anyway, we cut back to the academy and see Ozpin assigning teams, and now we can finally address the groups as their proper team names. John, Nora, Pyrrha, and Ren are Team Juniper, and unsurprisingly, RWBY, Weiss, Blake, and Yang are Team RWBY. Yang embraces RWBY and tells her how proud of her she is. It's all just smiles and fun all around. Elsewhere, we see Torchwick once again back on his bullshit. It seems like he's stolen some more dust and is wanting more men for whatever attack or robbery he's planning now. And that's the end of episode 8. If you didn't know any better, you might think this was some sort of season finale or something, but this is only the halfway point of volume 1. Whatever negative criticism or general critique I have of any episode before this one basically just doesn't apply to this episode. This episode is phenomenal. Definitely very cheesy at times, but the fight being what we've been working towards all these episodes, and finally getting that proper payoff is great. The music for the fight is also easily one of the best in RWBY, and I just can't really complain about anything here. I can't even complain about John not fighting too much here or anything, because he did a great job commanding the others in the fight, so there's that. But alright, so now that we're halfway through the first volume, I just want to talk about other things relating to RWBY I haven't had the chance to discuss as much, such as the music or the general aesthetic of the show, or even some of the behind the scenes of the show that I've looked into. Think of this as a general break before we get into the rest of the show, although if you do just want to get back into the summary, all the timestamps for every section of this video are in the description, so feel free. Let's talk about the music of RWBY. Easily one of its biggest strengths alongside the crazy fights. Is it cheesy sometimes? I mean, yeah. In the second verse of Yang's character theme, I Burn, the lyrics go, and I quote, "Kick my ass, I'm world class and Super Saiyan now," followed by a fairly standard rap verse that I can only describe as perfect for the level of cheese RWBY is typically at. It's not the best. But none of this is even to discredit any of those tracks or say they're outright bad or anything of that sort. Sure, there's gonna be lines that are a little too on the nose or just not subtle in any way. Then again, if you decided to watch RWBY for the subtlety, you're just kinda watching the wrong show. But the music's great. The large majority is high energy rock songs that fit the intensity and energy of stuff like the fights and the opening of the show. But then you have some tracks that are way more slower initially and more orchestra driven, like Weiss's theme from her trailer, Mirror Mirror, which starts out with a very distant and almost lonely sounding piano before Casey Williams' hauntingly amazing vocals come in and question, who's the loneliest of all? But then later in the song, this is flipped as the song ramps up when Weiss finally got the upper hand in the fight, and at the pinnacle of the fight, it comes back down and ends similarly to how it started, with mostly just the piano and vocals, alongside answering who's the loneliest of all, the singer. Or rather, Weiss, because the song is about her, duh. While we're not at Blake's whole backstory yet, and she's just this mysterious entity to us so far, her theme should give you more than enough info on her whole background and where her story's gonna go, with talking about being treated less than others, rising above suffering and hatred, and lastly, fighting for so much more than what we may see. The lyrics definitely come on a little strong, admittedly, again, no subtlety here at RWBY, but it's still a damn good track, and it's always been one of my personal favorites. Admittedly, one of the weakest tracks in terms of storytelling was always RWBY's original track from her trailer, Red Like Roses. But lucky for us, Jeff Williams did us a favor and made a part 2 to that track that allows us to understand RWBY beyond the happy and cheery exterior, and understand what's going on through her little hunter's brain and some crumbs of what the hell happened to her deceased mother. I'm almost certain this track has also gone on to become one of the most popular of the original RWBY tracks, and I'd say for good reason. It's a really fucking good track. It feels like it never ramps down. It starts at 100% and it just keeps going. And to make things better, we also get another vocalist with Sandy Casey, who I believe is Casey Lee Williams' mother. In specific, she does the second verse of the song as Summer Rose, RWBY's mother. And both Casey and Sandy even have a little harmonizing part in the song, and it's just so damn good. If there's something I can complain about here, however, despite all my love for the music, it's that you don't really get most of these tracks in the episodes themselves. Most of the ones I mentioned were just part of the trailers, with the exception of Red Like Roses 2, which was used for the big fight in episode 8. One song in particular I always wish they did more with is I May Fall. It gets some use in later volumes, but here in volume 1 it was just used as a random ending track for the outro, and that was kind of it. And it's a bit of a shame, given it feels like it would have had more potential as the opening song for volume 1, at least in my opinion. Now, what about RWBY's visuals and general aesthetics? Alright, so this first volume is admittedly not the prettiest. I don't think it's outright bad, and maybe due to my nostalgia, I think the show's original look has some charm to it, no doubt. Not some professionally made and visually stunning charm, more like amateurish but soulful charm, if you get what I mean. But as much as I can let the general style of everything slide, what I can't really let slide is the shadow people in the show. So, all of the background characters that are not strictly main or side characters in this first volume are just literally shadow people, like straight up. Not so much as a texture, generic outfits, nothing. Now, one of my favorite shows ever, Mawaru Penguin Drum, does a similar thing where literally every non-important character in the background and in crowds in populated areas are just these gray stick figure NPC looking things. But admittedly, in this show's case, it's more about a deeper meaning relative to the story and individualism. In the case of RWBY, it's more just a product of low budget and what seems to have been an iffy production time for this first volume. And I'm not gonna hold it that heavily against RWBY, but it's definitely always jarring to look at, especially considering every season beyond this is perfectly normal with that element. To give the show some slack, the large majority of the work put into the trailers was mostly done by Monty Oum and Shane Newville. In particular, Shane states that Monty animated the red and white trailers completely on his own. And the more I've researched this show, it becomes clear to me just how homemade a lot of this show was, bare minimum when it was just getting started. So many aspects of early RWBY were done by random suggestions or just a sudden idea someone here had. The grave RWBY visits in the red trailer was suggested to be her mother's grave by the composer of the show, Jeff Williams. The map of the world of Remnant in RWBY was made by Monty Oum just splattering some ketchup on a napkin at an IHOP. It's literally insane. The two main writers of RWBY, Carrie Shawcross and Miles Luna, showed an idea of what their writing process is like in a production diary video by showing the two just kind of sitting around and talking about pop culture shit and just spitballing ideas. RWBY started off as just some dudes trying to make an anime, and as rough as it was at the start, I feel it always had potential, surprisingly enough. Now, once the show entered production for Volume 1, they finally got a team together, although from a letter written by Shane Newville in 2016, there were apparently some general issues with certain people they didn't want on the team getting hired, or people they wanted hired didn't, and so on. I won't get too far into that, but it's clear that the production for this first volume was definitely all over the place, and rough in probably just about every way. So, I'll always at least give them some slack for that at the very least. And an obvious byproduct of the rough situations with Volume 1 is that basically most animations, aside from the fights, can be pretty rough. I suppose none of them are bad enough to the point where it's just not worth watching whatsoever. It's at the very least just clunky enough to where you can just watch it and laugh it off and just continue. Maybe crack some jokes about it if you're watching with friends or something like that. Lord knows I've done that watching with others. So, as sloppy and all over the place as this first volume is, that negative will always at least serve as some fuel for getting at least some sort of enjoyment out of it, at least in my opinion. And with that, I'd say that's all about I have to say for stuff like the music and visuals of RWBY. Later on, I'll talk more about my thoughts on the writing of the show, but that'll be once I'm done summarizing the rest of the volume. As well, I hope I haven't come across as too negative in this retrospective so far. I've mostly just been trying to criticize whatever I feel it deserves, but also trying to acknowledge the interesting circumstances surrounding the show, as I feel way too many RWBY reviews focus a little too much on the negative, while not giving too much attention to the good sides that are also present to give it a nice and fair criticism. Believe me though, I've got plenty more of criticisms to give, but enough of that. Let's continue on with the volume. Getting back into things, episode 9 starts off with Weiss waking up with her slightly discolored hair, and RWBY wakes her up further with a whistle. It turns out that the team still need to unpack and clean their mess of a room, and they all have really long arms for some reason. Yang hangs up a Gamerman poster, which is fucked up. Blake is putting away books, one in particular being some silly little romance one, and RWBY is adjusting the curtains before she just tears it the hell up for some reason. So with that, we've learned that Team RWBY fucking sucks at decorating. RWBY suggests to clear up space, they make their beds into bunk beds, and a couple of low-quality MP3 sound effects later, they've done it. It then dawns upon RWBY that, hey, they're in a school, and they need to go to class. In class, we get to see an actual teacher here, and he sure is teaching. And by that I mean after he finishes explaining Huntsmen as the protectors of this world, he literally just starts making general noises as the other characters start talking, like stereotypical blah 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 and shit. RWBY basically makes her own rendition of Big Fat Meanie, and as she keeps slacking off and picking her nose, Weiss is irritated beyond reasonable amounts, and the teacher asks who would like to challenge a Grimm, and she immediately volunteers in a blind rage. Oh boy, and that's the episode. A shorter one, but I guess just a simple one to cool things down after the action of last episode, basically. I don't have much to say about this episode. It's not too bad to have an episode to give viewers to just kind of process everything that's been going on, also while establishing and reminding everyone that, oh yeah, they're students in a school. They go to class. Not a bad episode, I'd say. Episode 10 picks up immediately where 9 leaves off, with Weiss making a rash decision to battle against the Grimm to demonstrate her skills in front of the class. She mostly gets her ass kicked, and RWBY even tries to give her advice, but Weiss just snaps back at her before getting an opening and defeating the Grimm. Barely. Apparently that's all that was gonna happen in the class as well, because, alright, end of class. Anyway, after class, RWBY confronts Weiss about her attitude, and Weiss calls her annoying and questions her position as the leader of the group, specifically saying Ozpin made a mistake in choosing her as the leader. Ozpin, unsurprisingly, overhears this. Weiss goes to talk with the teacher from the class, whose name is like Port or something, and she tries talking to him about her thoughts regarding RWBY being the leader, presumably in hopes of getting some reassurance, but is given pushback immediately. Ozpin, talking with RWBY about basically the same thing, elaborates on the same point, also adding that it's also been like a day. Weiss is somehow shocked by this, and after trying to snap back girl boss style at her teacher, she begins to realize that there may be some truth to what some of them have been saying to her. And after this not stunning realization, Weiss goes up to RWBY's top bunk of the night, having fallen asleep studying, and the two smooth things out. Despite them really hammering in just how much of an asshole Weiss is and can be in this first volume, this was a sweet little ending to the episode. Admittedly, not much went on in this episode, but I'll never really complain about Weiss' character development, especially given that she can be really hard to listen to sometimes in this first volume, since again, they really hammer in this whole she's a bitch, she's snobby, she's rich characterization here, so having a little less of that is refreshing. That's the end of my episode criticism though, another bite-sized, more character-centric episode with not too much in terms of plot in this case, and that's alright I'd say. Moving on with episode 11, we start off with John fighting against Cardin, and he's not doing too great. I mean, he's getting taunted and even just gets kicked in the gut straight up. Glinda, ignoring the shit that just went down, scolds John for not paying attention to his aura on his scroll, which is basically to say he's not looking at his health bar. As well, she reminds everyone that the Vital Festival, where other kingdoms will come here to Beacon and compete in a tournament, will be happening soon, and Team RWBY seems super excited. How cute. Back with the other team though, Pyrrha seems worried about John. She tries asking him what's wrong at lunch, because something's clearly off, which RWBY even agrees with, but John tries to reassure them that he's okay. And we see Cardin being the worst and bullying a girl with rabbit ears. I guess now's as good a time as any to mention Faunus. In the world of Remnant, you have humans and you have Faunus. Faunus look basically the same as humans, albeit with some animal traits. Sometimes a tail, sometimes some ears, sometimes they might even have scales on their skin, and so on. We'll get more into this as the season progresses, but figured I'd give you a rundown before they get too deep into this aspect of the world, and you're suddenly left wondering what the hell I'm talking about. Anyway, John tries convincing his friends that Cardin has never bullied him, and we get a comically ridiculous montage of Cardin doing exactly that to John. And it's honestly a little funny. Like, John gets stuffed in a locker that is then sent flying off to Lord knows where. But Pyrrha tries to remind John that if he needs help, he can just ask for it. And Nora suggests breaking his legs, which, I mean, it's not a bad idea, honestly. Unfortunately, Australian Rabbit Girl is now being bullied by Cardin and his group. Yang remarks on how hard it must be to be a Faunus, and the episode ends with Cardin glaring at John. Surely this freak of a man isn't planning more comically evil shit to pull on John, is he? But anyway, this episode is an interesting one. It's the second shortest episode in the volume, but it decides to finally introduce another Faunus, and the idea that they have it pretty rough. Albeit only just them getting bullied at school, but the idea is still present now. This becomes a far more prevalent idea as RWBY progresses, and considering they're the other main people populating this world alongside humans, it's definitely something that they needed to introduce sooner or later. So I can at least give this episode props for that, even if it's on a far minor scale. We continue the trend of John not having a good time with episode 12. In one of our other vague classes here at Beacon Academy, green-haired Otacon zips around talking about some history relating to the Faunus, and asks if any Faunus in his class have been discriminated against. An Australian rabbit girl, whose name is Velvet by the way, raises her hand. John, being asleep in class, gets called on to answer a question on what advantage the Faunus may have had during an ambush in the night, and answers incorrectly. To which Carden says some frankly wild shit.
Well, I know it's a lot easier to train an animal than a soldier.
Pyrrha manages to get things back on track and gives the correct answer of many Faunus apparently have night vision, and Blake further expands on this answer, which angers Carden. John decides now's as good a time as any to laugh and gets told off by green-haired Otacon, and both him and Carden are told to stay after class, where he tells them that he wants them to write an essay on some pages in their textbook, and that's that. The two exit the classroom and Carden shoves him down, to which John's protector Pyrrha tells him she really will break his legs, and then she takes him up to the roof. Here, John makes a fucking suicide joke, which I honestly never really caught until like my fourth rewatch. And honestly, it's fucked up, but it's funny. And Pyrrha pulls back John as she thinks she might have just given him the complete wrong impression. And as stupid as this moment really is, it's a little cute, I guess. But anyway, Pyrrha offers to help John and train him, but John immediately refuses. And when Pyrrha brings up his qualifications and being here at Beacon in the first place, John finally reveals that he doesn't actually belong here. He got some fake transcripts to get in. And when questioned by her, John says that he just wanted to be a hero like all of the other people in his life. He doesn't just want to be the lovable idiot, the damsel in distress. He wants to be a hero in his own right. And Pyrrha walks off, and as if the situation couldn't get worse between the two, Carden was apparently right below in his dorm and heard everything with the window open. Unsurprisingly, he's gonna hold this against him and tell everyone unless John does whatever the hell he wants him to do. As easy as it is to rag on John for not being the best character in the show or being a little pathetic or whatever, I think this episode puts a lot of his character in a different light, and I can respect it. It allows us to understand this little freak of a man a little better, and I'm all for it. It's far from perfect, but it's something, I suppose. Carden is obviously the worst, but considering he's a bully character, I suppose that means he's doing his job right, so next episode. Episode 13 starts off with Pyrrha and the rest of Team Juniper worried over where John has been in recent times. And as it turns out, he's listening in on this conversation right outside their door. RWBY catches him off guard and questions where he's been, so he explains the whole situation with Carden blackmailing him turning down Pyrrha's training, and that he's just basically messed up big time. RWBY literally goes nope. And as silly as this sounds initially, RWBY says this to tell John that as a leader, you're not allowed to mess up, and that you're supposed to keep pushing forward no matter what. Because it's not just for you yourself, it's for your team. After her pep talk, RWBY heads to bed and John receives an order from Carden to capture a bunch of wasps. He does not get any less comically evil by the episode one fucking bit. The following day, Glinda gives everyone their instructions for what to do in the forest, specifically to collect jars of red sap, all while trying to avoid the Grimm. Unsurprisingly, Carden's taking advantage of John and makes him do all the work, which leaves Pyrrha still worried about him. Carden specifically tells John to get 6 jars of sap, despite there only being 5 of them, so that he can use the extra to throw at Pyrrha and then use the wasp that he got last night to attack her, as payback for embarrassing him in class. Carden threatens to tell his secret if John doesn't throw the jar, and right as he lifts it, he refuses and throws it directly at Carden. Big Bully Carden is mad and grabs John as the episode ends. This episode isn't too much on its own given that it's a 2-parter, but it's good at least seeing characters pushing John in a good direction, with RWBY giving him advice from one leader to another. And as shitty as Carden is, at least bare minimum at the end here, John finally stands up to him. So we got that at least. Aside from that, I'd say more of my thoughts stand with the second part of this episode, so let's continue. Next up is episode 14. Right off the bat, we get Carden beating the shit out of John, and as he's doing so and even taunting him, John talks back to him and defends the honor of his team. Right as Carden is going to punch him in the face for talking back, John somehow stops this punch with his aura? I believe? Suddenly, a giant bear grim arrives and immediately goes after Carden, as he's still covered in the sap. Of course, Carden is no match for a giant fucking bear, and the rest of his team run away. Team RWBY and the rest of Team Juniper hear this and rush to the help. The writers finally deciding that it's now time that Carden gets shit thrown his way, gets slapped silly by the bear grim before help arrives. Surprisingly, John comes in to shield him from a hit and begins to even fight back. And despite getting knocked away multiple times, John just keeps fighting the Grim. As both him and the Grim go in for huge swings, Pyrrha uses her semblance, or her ability rather, to assist him in decapitating the Grim and ending the fight. Pyrrha's semblance gives her the power to control magnetism, and as Weiss and RWBY are thinking of telling John what happened with her help, Pyrrha instead tells the two that she just wants to keep it a secret. Back with John, he helps Carden up and tells him to leave him and his team alone. Finally, there's our payoff. Back at the rooftop, John is approached by Pyrrha and he immediately apologizes for turning down her offers, but she reassures him that it's okay and that their team misses their leader. Before Pyrrha walks off, John brings up the offer of being trained once more and Pyrrha shoves him down. Alright, damn, and that's the episode. In general, I feel like a bunch of these previous episodes have done a solid job building up more and more of the world of Remnant, as well as giving us a better understanding of some of these characters and maybe why they act as strangely as they do. It's not paced the best, but it's something. An attempt is made, I suppose. And this one really does help give us a better understanding, I'd say. I mean, John getting an arc, no pun intended, that helps make him more understandable and also gives him solid and redeeming moments after seeing him as a bit of a weirdo, is great. I think it's near impossible for me to have any negative feelings towards Pyrrha, as she's literally only the most positive and helpful character, especially since she's doing her best to push John in a good direction. Or rather shove in this case. Overall, this was a great episode, and getting a typical dork gets back at his bully story never gets old, so no real complaints on my end. The most I can think of is a slight nitpick with maybe some more characterization with Ren and Nora, but given the less than 2-hour runtime of Volume 1, I mean, I can't criticize them too hard on that. As well, the two get plenty of screen time and character development, backstory, whatever, later on in the show, so with that in mind, it's really not that big an issue. We're nearing the end here, so let's get through the last 2 episodes. Episode 15 begins back with our wonderful Team RWBY walking through the town and talking about preparations going on for the Vital Festival, before deciding to go to the docks because Weiss wants to welcome folks from other kingdoms here, which Blake assumes is just to get the upper hand on them during the tournament. She's right, but then they notice that a dust shop was robbed, but only the dust itself was taken. The cops presume it to be the work of the White Fang, and Weiss enters her bigot arc by calling the White Fang a bunch of degenerates. Blake gives pushback to her, talking down on the White Fang, but Weiss just keeps at it and keeps saying terrible things about the group. RWBY also puts 2 and 2 together and realizes that maybe the dust shop robbery was Torchwick, given that's how she came across him initially. Weiss says that all Faunus know is eat hot chip and lie, albeit in a far more racist and less funny way. I'm sorry, I actually wrote that. And we see a Faunus getting chased around town by the police. He then runs past Team RWBY and winks at Blake? Okay. Weiss assumes he's maybe someone they'll be going up against at some point during our required tournament arc, given that this is an anime-like show. And the group follows after the Faunus dude. I'm gonna make this easier on myself and just tell you that that's Sun. Sun Wukong. I think my favorite thing about Sun is that the name and him having a monkey tail are the farthest thing from subtle, or even trying to be more inspired by the source of inspiration. It is kind of funny though. Anyway, after trying to catch up to Sun, they lose track of him and bump into a girl who greets them from the ground. A little strange, but her name is Penny, by the way. Everyone introduces themselves back and RWBY calls her a friend. And as the group are about to walk off, Penny asks her if she really is her friend. Everyone else is practically begging RWBY to say no, but she says yes anyway. Yang decides to ask Penny what she's doing here in Vel, and she tells them that she's going to participate in the tournament. Weiss, deciding that causing problems earlier wasn't enough, asks Penny if she knows the Faunus from earlier, and calls him some pretty wild shit, like she calls him a fucking rapscallion. Who the fuck says that? Do the writers know people don't actually say that, as much less like teenage girls? But this causes Blake to get more and more irritated at her. The two get into an argument and keep at it, even back at the dorm. On Weiss's end of the argument, she claims that her family is a victim to the White Fang, and the Faunus as a whole, since they've been at war with her family for a long time. I mean, she's still pretty messed up for how she talks about Faunus though. But Weiss ends up pushing Blake to her breaking point, and while arguing back, she refers to the Faunus as we and runs off. Oops. We cut to Blake taking off her conveniently placed bow to reveal the craziest thing of all. She's a cat girl with little cat ears. Blake being a faunus was the most telegraphed and foreshadowed thing ever, but I'm glad we finally have it out of the way so I can stop dancing around that little detail about her character. Back to the story, Ruby notices Blake still hasn't returned, and out in the town she mentions how she's been gone the whole weekend. The team keep discussing it, and Weiss keeps bad-mouthing the White Fang despite this kind of being all her fault. But Ruby's just worried about her safety. Wrapping things up, we see Blake and Sun eating lunch together, and it turns out Sun wants to know more about her, and that's the end of the episode. This one was pretty all over the place, quite frankly. We get introduced to two completely new characters, both of which will stick around for a while, whether you like it or not. One who will be in the eventual tournament, and one who's a faunus. Again, something that they've been building up to and talking about little by little at this point. I'll be honest, I'm not the most fond of this episode. In general, I'm a little biased as I'm not the biggest fan of Sun. I just don't think he ever really did much to add on to the overall plot of RWBY, or even push the plot forward or anything for the most part. It just feels like he's always kind of been along for the ride, and I guess for folks who like him or don't mind him, that's great. I'm just personally not a fan. But I do suppose the general idea of introducing more faunus into the story is not a bad idea whatsoever. It's just a bit much considering you've also introduced a completely separate character into the same episode. Maybe it's because it's almost double the length of so many of the shorter episodes that I take so much issue with its unfocused approach to pushing the general idea of the plot forward, since in the case of smaller episodes, it's over and done with before I can take any real issues with it. Maybe by this point, the Weiss is a bitch shtick is just really overstaying its welcome. I'm not too sure. With that though, let's move on to the last episode we'll be covering in this video. And after how much time here, we're finally at episode 16, the finale to volume 1. We more or less pick right back up where we left off with Sun chatting with Blake. She speaks some more about the White Fang and reveals that she used to be a member of the group, having been in it since she was a kid. At least back before, when the group was still more of a rebellion thing to fight for faunus rights. Although 5 years ago, a new leader took up the White Fang, and their methods to rebelling became far more aggressive, but despite this, they were finally being treated as equals. From this, Sun asks Blake if she's ever mentioned this to any of her friends, and of course, she hasn't. Back with Team RWBY, they're still looking for Blake. Weiss suggests calling the police involved, and RWBY calls it a bad idea. Penny shows up suddenly and the group fills her in on the situation, to which she notes that Blake had cat ears. And the group realizes this like, wait, oh yeah, I guess that bow was weirdly conveniently placed and also cat ear shaped, huh? Back with Blake and Sun, the two are at the docks keeping an eye on whatever's going on with the dust shipment when the White Fang arrive, and we finally see everyone's favorite cartoony motherfucker, Torchwick, once again. Blake is shocked by this, considering the White Fang would never normally work with a human, much less someone like Torchwick. So she moves forward and threatens Torchwick before questioning the White Fang members on why they're working with him. Torchwick tells her that they're working for him as part of some business venture, and more ships arrive to cause more trouble. Torchwick blasts Blake back with his cane gun thing, as he's done plenty of times by this point, and Sun finally joins in and helps fight Torchwick with his honestly cool nunchuck gun things that can also be made into a staff. Some more White Fang members drop in as backup for Torchwick, and Sun fends them off. Blake and Sun both then take on Torchwick before Torchwick shoots down a shipping container, splitting off the two. In the distance, RWBY noticed the commotion and came to see what was up, and maybe even help. Sadly, she just decided to stand there as she recognized Torchwick for a moment, giving him the perfect opportunity to shoot her directly. Lucky for her, Penny is here to help and finally gets to show off her combat skills. If you watch the show itself and you didn't outright realize it by this point, Penny is an android. She pulls out various blades controlled by thin strings out of her back and holds off hordes of White Fang members with extreme ease. She even shoots a giant green laser that splits multiple ships in half. And in case that wasn't enough of a showcase of her strength, she uses her blades to latch onto a ship and then pulls the ship down. Although in the chaos, Torchwick manages to slip away before things get worse. Finally, Team RWBY is back together. RWBY tries to defend Blake as Weiss walks up to them, and Blake even does her best to explain what she never told her team before, but Weiss tells her to just stop. None of that matters to her anymore. All that matters to her is that next time if she has some sort of issue like that, she wants her to talk about it with her team instead of running off to others. Also, Sun is just kinda there. RWBY realizes they lost track of Penny, but we see her being escorted off after being scolded for running off on her own. Lastly, Ozpin receives a cryptic message on his scroll, and that's it. That's the end of the season. Wait, no, post-credits scene, sorry. In our post-credits scene, Torchwick is approached suddenly by a shadowy woman and her lackeys, who are seemingly not satisfied with his work, but hope he can do more for them in the future. Now that's the end of the volume. So, quite frankly, this season finale is very sloppy and all over the place, but it's got the usual RWBY charm of crazy over the top and super high energy, beautifully choreographed fights. Silly bits of humor sprinkled in and cheesy writing with a side of foreshadowing. In a lot of ways, I get about the same feelings I get about the first episode of the show with this finale. It's amateurish, but it's fun. It takes itself seriously to an extent, but you can only get so serious when your villain looks like Torchwick does. While I did complain about Sun and Penny being introduced in the previous episode, I suppose it at least makes their inclusion in the fights here slightly more reasonable than it would otherwise. I still would have loved to see some of our already established characters involved in this fight though. I mean, RWBY immediately gets discarded, but Weiss and Yang were just nowhere to be found in this fight in any way, which is a bit of a shame. I suppose they won't always be involved in every fight ever, but given that RWBY was able to find Blake, as was Penny, and considering the commotion at the docks, I don't think it would have been too hard to believe that Weiss or Yang would have been able to find their way to that as well. But overall, that's it though. That's Volume 1. 4 trailers, 16 episodes, all totaling to about 2 hours and 13 minutes worth of content. I'm sure nowadays, especially with how negative people can be about RWBY, it may be hard to see why so many folks truly fell in love with this show and everything about it. But I hope that me being one of those people, and giving you my thoughts from being there since day one, can help anyone who maybe didn't quite get it, well, get it. It's an entire season that's over and done with before you really even know it, especially for standard show lengths. And there's so much of it that doesn't even really matter in the grand scheme of things or is resolved by the next episode. As I've said many times, it's amateurish, but it's that side of it that makes it so appealing. It's trying its best to be something, and despite a lot of it not necessarily being something that is incredible, the few sparkles here and there with some of the characters or the music or obviously the fights getting dragged into the show, whether your choice or not, I personally always felt there was something of value for everyone. Do you like cool anime fights? Great. You get some amazing one here. How about some great music? You can realistically listen to all the RWBY music without ever having watched a single second of the show. Maybe some likable characters? Maybe not Volume 1 Weiss, but I've been a Yang fan since day one and I'm still very fond of the character, so I'm sure there's a character here for you. Perhaps you love stupidly cheesy dialogue? Well, perfect for you. That's most of this season especially. Oh god, is there a lot of cheesy dialogue. So, the writing. Oh dear, the writing. There's actually some really interesting bits of foreshadowing in here from the very first volume that come into play way later down the road, and I'll give them props for that, bare minimum. But with my props out of the way, I'll just be honest, the writing in this first season can vary from bearable to just not good. Most of the time it's very standard fare, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but then you have moments where the writers just decided to say the most generic things imaginable. My personal favorite example of this is Yang going, well, that was a thing, after the fight against the giant bird Grimm. Like, why? Well, the reason from what I can tell is that the two main writers and co-creators of RWBY, Carrie Shawcross and Miles Luna, seemingly had no experience writing beforehand. This isn't even to slam them for not being the best from the start or anything, it just kind of explains why they'd go for something like obvious generic lines here and there or something of the sort. Admittedly, I don't think either of them are the best writers, but I'll give them props for at least going at it and trying to make something happen alongside Monty's crazy fights. The first season I also personally think is easily the most lighthearted season of RWBY, because as anyone who has watched bare minimum the first 3 volumes of this show can tell you, stuff gets dark real fast. And because of that, I feel it can definitely be hard at times to come back to this first volume, given that so much of it doesn't feel like RWBY, or at least what current RWBY is in a lot of regards. And maybe the show has just grown far too serious. Or maybe that first season was just too cheesy and on the nose. I would argue for the second point, but I also understand if anyone felt the first one as well. It just gets so jarring to have these moments of stuff like Blake talking about Faunus not having the same rights as humans do, and also having goofy shit like Weiss and RWBY bonding over calling their dresses combat skirts. I'm not saying it can't work, but it's definitely something that's harder to pull off, and this volume definitely struggled to get it right. Don't get me wrong though, there's still moments that get a chuckle out of me even now. They can just be fucking jarring to see sometimes whenever there's anything serious happening before or after them. I feel this fairly often with a lot of Marvel movies, for example, and sometimes the humor here reminds me a little too much of that, for better or for worse. But before we get to our conclusion, I'd just like to give a quick rundown on my thoughts of our 2 main teams and my thoughts on each character. I'll try and do that every time we do these RWBY retrospectives near the end, but anyway. Let's start with Team RWBY, of course. RWBY is a bit of a lovable idiot with a big ass scythe, and I can't bring myself to hate her. She's goofy as shit in Volume 1, but she's trying her best, so I guess she's fine. Weiss is a character that I originally did not like whatsoever until like my third rewatch of the show, and if you don't like her here in the first volume, don't worry. She's just not very good here. Blake doesn't have too much going on for her in this first volume as her backstory comes in pretty late, but I think having her challenge Weiss's views, as annoying as it was to constantly hear Weiss say the same shit, it at least gave Blake more depth, albeit at the cost of Weiss. And Yang is a character I will probably never have too much negative shit to say about because I am painfully biased. She's been my favorite character ever since her original trailer, and she still is. She's a fun, energetic, and upbeat character that also kicks ass here in Volume 1. Although minus 2 points for giving her cheesy lines here though. On to Team Juniper. John is John. He's not the easiest character to like in my honest opinion. If you like him, great, and if you don't, I get it. Being caught up with RWBY and awaiting Volume 9, I think he's honestly not bad at all, but getting him to that point was an uphill battle, and seeing his short progression here was promising at the very least. Nora can come across as very annoying, but I think that's just because she's a bit quirky and very, very loud. I like the dynamic between her and Ren, and I'd say that carries the two characters for me, quite frankly. And we don't know much about Ren at the moment beyond his dynamic with Nora, and honestly, I'd say that's fine. Lastly, Pyrrha. Pyrrha is just a pretty solid character that I think's pretty interesting, even from the get-go here. Sure, there are some things about her that I don't fully get or make much sense, such as her being interested in John near immediately, or even keeping her helping John with her semblance a secret. It just doesn't really add up in my opinion. Like, I can vaguely understand aspects of it, but given the character we've been shown so far, none of it makes too much sense in my opinion. To not end things off on a sour note, let me reiterate that I do genuinely love this show. Why else would I rewatch Volume 1 fresh off of rewatching it for like the 5th time so some friends could get into the show I love so dearly? Like, dude, my icon on Discord has been like Yang in some way for like the past half year. I regularly listen to the soundtrack to this day. I'm a fan. A huge fucking fan. Sure, I have my problems with it, but I also have a lot of problems with my most favorite movies and shows. And that's really just to say that I care about them that deeply to think about them to probably not a normal extent. It is what it is, man. And with that, my RWBY retrospective on the trailers in Volume 1 is over. If you're wondering, I plan on making a retrospective on every volume of RWBY, just don't expect them to come out one after the other. If you would like to see more of these though, consider subscribing to see whenever those come out in the future. I also have a video planned talking about RWBY Ice Queendom sometime, so if that sounds interesting to you all, again, consider subscribing. But I do hope you enjoyed the video. This is easily my longest video yet, and I originally thought it was gonna be like half an hour, so yeah, I was wrong. But let me know in the comments about your thoughts on this volume and when you got into RWBY, if ever. Aside from that, if you enjoyed the video and would like to support my content further, as well as get your name in the credits of the video, and early access and previews, consider supporting me on Patreon for $5 a month. You should be seeing the names of my lovely patrons on screen right about now. Aren't they the coolest? That's gonna be it for me though, everyone. Hope you all are doing well, and I hope to see you in the next video. Take care, everyone, and stay safe. Bye-bye.